Jacob Nash had written only 3 letters in his entire adult life. The first was to order seed. The second to argue with the bank about his mortgage. The third was to ask the Territorial Mail Service to find him a bride, because 35 years of solitude had finally broken something inside him he could no longer patch with hard work or whiskey. When Emily Pierce stepped off the wagon that September morning, she looked exactly as she'd said in her letters. Blonde hair, green eyes, 22 years old, clutching a small leather satchel like it carried her whole world. What she hadn't mentioned was the way her gaze lingered on his scarred hands, as if she already knew each mark, or how she glanced at his kitchen window and smiled, as if she'd seen the cracked pane that leaked cold air every winter dawn when he made his coffee. But when she shook his hand, everything stopped. Her fingers pressed the exact spot where his thumb had been crushed 2 years ago under a falling timber, the place that still ached before storms. She touched it gently, knowingly, and said his name like she'd been saying it her whole life. Jacob jerked his hand back, staring at this woman who was supposed to be a stranger. No one knew about that injury. He'd been alone when it happened, alone when he'd set the bone himself, alone when he'd learned to work around the stiffness. He'd never written a word about it to her. Yet here she was, standing in his front yard with the dust settling around her boots, acting as if she'd lived here before. The silence between them felt sharp as barbed wire. His hand still tingled where she'd touched him, and he studied her face for any sign of recognition, any clue to explain how a woman from 3 territories away could know a secret he'd hidden from everyone, even his neighbor Bill Caldwell, who lived 5 miles off and rarely visited. Emily didn't flinch at his stare. She adjusted her satchel and looked past him toward the house, her green eyes catching details that made his chest tighten. She noticed the loose board on the porch step, the crooked front door frame, the rain barrel under the broken gutter. Things no one could guess from 3 short paragraphs he'd written, where he'd barely mentioned the house at all. "Your home is exactly as I imagined," she said softly. Her voice carried no nervousness, no surprise. It sounded like familiarity. "How exactly did you imagine it?" Jacob asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Her calm expression flickered, just for an instant, before the careful smile returned. "From your letters. You described it so well." Jacob remembered every word he'd sent, practical notes about the ranch, about loneliness chewing through a man like acid. He hadn't described the way dawn light slanted through the kitchen window, or which porch board creaked when you stepped wrong. The wagon driver cleared his throat, anxious to unload her trunk and head back to town before dark. Jacob paid him without looking away from her, watching as she moved toward the door with steps that were far too sure for someone seeing this place for the first time. When she grasped the door handle, she turned it with just enough pressure to keep it from sticking, exactly the trick only he knew. That was when Jacob realized, whatever game was being played here, he didn't know the rules. Inside, Emily set her satchel on his kitchen table, then walked straight to the narrow cabinet by the window, the one that looked like it held cleaning rags but actually hid his small stack of dishes. She pulled out 2 cups without opening a wrong door. Too precise, too confident. Jacob felt something cold crawl down his spine. "I thought we might have coffee while we talk," she said, already reaching for the pot on the stove. "You always make it strong, don't you? Like your father used to." The words hit Jacob like a hammer. He had never mentioned his father in his letters. Not to her. Not to anyone. His father had been dead 15 years. Few people even remembered how the old man liked his coffee. "Who told you about my father?" Jacob's voice was low and dangerous now. Emily froze mid-motion, just for a second, then forced a calm smile. "You must have said it in one of your letters." "I didn't," Jacob said flatly, stepping closer. "I wrote 3 letters in my life. I remember every word." For the first time, she backed up against the counter, her eyes darting toward the window as if calculating something. He caught a look there. No confusion, no innocent shock. Calculation. "You're frightening me," she whispered. But her voice was steady, and her hands didn't tremble. "Good," Jacob said. "You've been frightening me since you stepped off that wagon." The fading afternoon light stretched long shadows across the kitchen floor. Jacob realized night would soon fall, leaving him alone inside this house with a woman who knew impossible things. Outside, the wagon rattled away, taking his last connection to the ordinary world with it. Jacob didn't move from the doorway, blocking her only exit. Emily stayed by the counter, her green eyes calm, but there was a tightness in her jaw he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't afraid, not the way someone would be if they'd just met a man with a rifle over the fireplace. She was waiting for something, letting him do the thinking. That unsettled him more than fear ever could. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said finally, voice soft but steady. "Maybe I should explain." "That'd be a fine start," Jacob muttered, keeping his eyes on her hands. Emily reached for the leather satchel, and his shoulders tensed. But instead of a weapon, she pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed around the edges. She laid it on the table carefully, as if it were fragile. "That's your letter," she said. "The real one, not the one you think you sent." Jacob frowned. "I sent one letter to the mail order service. 3 paragraphs. That's it." "You sent 2, she said quietly. "The second came a month later. You were drunk. I think it was different." Her words sank into him like cold rain. A month later, late October, the anniversary of his father's death. That week always hollowed him out. He would sit at this same table with a bottle, let the whiskey strip his defenses until he was raw and foolish. He had no memory of writing another letter. "What did I write?" he asked, though every part of him didn't want to know. "Everything." Emily's voice didn't waver. "About your father's coffee. About the beam that crushed your thumb. About how you talk to yourself when no one's around. About the way you count fence posts to keep from thinking about being alone. About the dreams that wake you up screaming." Jacob felt sick. If she was telling the truth, then he'd spilled every private shame on a paper like a man begging to be known. He clenched his fists. "I don't believe you," he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing, even to him. "Read it." She nodded at the letter. "It's in your handwriting." Jacob stared at the folded paper, but didn't touch it. The thought of seeing his soul laid bare in drunken scrawl turned his stomach. "Keep it," he said roughly. "I don't want to see what kind of fool I made of myself." "You weren't a fool." Her voice softened, and for the first time, he heard something human in it, something tender. "You were hurting. You just wanted someone to know you exist, that your pain matters to somebody." The gentleness in her tone hurt worse than mockery. Jacob turned away, staring out the window at his own reflection, ghost-like in the glass. The land outside stretched into darkness, 100 empty acres that had been both his refuge and his prison. "So you came all this way to marry a man who pours his guts out to strangers." His voice was bitter. "What kind of woman does that?" "The kind who understands what it means to be alone," she said simply. When he turned back, her calm mask was cracked. Beneath it, he saw something raw and familiar. The same desperate hunger for connection that had driven him to write that first letter, and apparently the second one too. "You're running from something," he said, not a question. Emily's eyes glistened in the fading light, and she nodded. "My father died last spring. He left debts. The kind of debts that don't just disappear." "What kind?" Jacob asked. "The kind that follow you," she said quietly. "The kind that get collected one way or another." He felt the floor tilt under him. He had wanted a wife to ease his loneliness. Instead, he'd opened his door to trouble. "How much?" he asked. "More than you have. More than anyone has unless they own a railroad." Her jaw tightened as she spoke. Jacob's mind raced. If she was telling the truth, she brought dangerous men straight to his door. His quiet, carefully guarded solitude wasn't safe anymore. Then, faint but clear, came the sound of hoofbeats. Both of them froze. The rhythm was steady, echoing through the still evening air. The sound of a rider coming up the main road. Emily's face went pale, and she gripped the edge of the table with trembling hands. "How long until they find you?" Jacob asked quietly. "I thought I had more time," she whispered. Jacob went to the window, peering through the dim light. A lone figure rode in slow, easy. Not chasing, not hunting. When the horse came close, Jacob recognized the bay mare first, then the slouched posture of the rider. "It's Bill," Jacob said, exhaling. Emily sagged with relief. Bill Caldwell was his closest thing to a friend. A man who lived alone by choice, who had a habit of showing up whenever something went wrong. Jacob opened the door before Bill could knock. The older man stepped inside, hat in hand, eyes sweeping over the room. He saw everything at once: the cold coffee, the tension in the air, the way Emily stood like she was ready to bolt. "Evening, Jacob." "Ma'am," Bill said in his gravelly voice. "Saw the wagon heading back. Figured your bride arrived." "She did," Jacob said carefully. Bill studied them a moment longer. "Also saw 3 riders an hour back. Good horses. Didn't look like ranch hands. They're headed this way." Emily made a small sound, almost a whimper. Bill's sharp eyes fixed on her, reading her fear. He didn't ask questions yet. "Did they stop in town?" Jacob asked. "Didn't see, but they're riding like they know where they're going. Not much out here except your place, mine, and that abandoned Hartley spread." The room went quiet, heavy with understanding. "Bill," Jacob said slowly, "you might want to head home. Get clear of whatever's coming." Bill looked at Emily, then at Jacob, reading their faces. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and crossed his arms. "Been a quiet year," he said mildly. "Could use some excitement." The sound of more hoofbeats rolled closer through the darkness. The hoofbeats grew louder, steady, and purposeful. Jacob walked to the fireplace, took down the rifle that always hung loaded above it. No man lived alone out here without expecting trouble now and then, but this was different. This was coming straight for his door. Bill's hand rested easily on his revolver, the way a man might scratch an old scar. "How many men are we talking about?" he asked quietly. "At least 3, Emily whispered. "Maybe more. They work for Marcus Kellerman. He doesn't send men who give up easy." Jacob felt a cold knot tighten in his gut at the name. Everybody in the territory knew Kellerman, owned banks, owned politicians, broke families when they couldn't pay. And if Emily's father had owed him money, it wasn't just about dollars. It was about power, about making examples. "What did your father owe?" Jacob asked. 20,000, she said, her voice barely audible. "Maybe more with interest." The number hit like a blow. 20,000 was more than Jacob's ranch would fetch on its best day. No wonder she'd run. No wonder she'd answered a lonely rancher's letter. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Spurs jingled. Leather creaked as men dismounted. Through the window, Jacob could see shadows moving into position. Not careless drifters, but men who knew how to box a place in. A knock came at the door. Polite. Too polite. "Miss Pierce," a voice called, smooth and measured. "We know you're in there. We've traveled a long way to speak with you. Let's have a friendly talk." Emily pressed herself against the wall beside the window, pale as paper. "That's Vincent Harrow," she whispered. "Kellerman's right hand. If he's here himself, they're not just here for money." Bill glanced at Jacob, eyes narrowing. "What else would they want?" "My father kept records," Emily said, gripping her satchel tight against her chest. "Documents proving Kellerman's been stealing from his own bank, buying land with other people's deposits. Names, dates, everything. If these papers get to the right hands, Kellerman's finished." Jacob felt his whole world tilting. This wasn't just about hiding a scared young woman. This was about going up against the most dangerous man in the territory. "Where are the papers?" Jacob asked. Emily hugged the satchel tighter. He understood then. Everything Kellerman feared, everything his men had killed for, was sitting at Jacob's kitchen table. The door handle rattled gently. "Miss Pierce," Harrow's voice came again, still pleasant, still carrying steel. "I'm going to count to 10. If you don't open this door, my men will." Jacob blew out the lamp, plunging the room into pale moonlight. "Back window," he said quickly, "leads to the corral. If you make it to the barn, there's a horse ready." "They'll see me before I reach it," Emily whispered. 3, Harrow called outside. Bill stood up, checking his revolver with calm hands. "Been a while since I had a proper fight," he said, almost cheerful. 4, Jacob chambered a round in the rifle. The sound was sharp in the tense room. He'd fought raiders and cattle thieves in his younger years. He knew what it meant to kill when killing was necessary. And looking at Emily's terrified face, he decided it was necessary now. "When they come through that door," Jacob said, voice low, "you run. Don't stop. Don't look back. 5, I won't let you die for my father's mistakes. Emily said, shaking her head hard. Your father wasn't making mistakes, Jacob said firmly. He was fighting a criminal. 6. Bill moved toward the far side of the room, crouching low. Don't worry about me, he muttered. I'll be fine. 7. Jacob took a steady breath, rifle firm against his shoulder. Get ready. 8. Emily's lips trembled. I can't. 9. You can't, Jacob said sharply. Now go. 10. The front door exploded inward in a spray of splinters. Vincent Harrow stepped through, revolver raised, flanked by 2 riflemen. He was younger than Jacob expected. Smooth face, fine clothes, the kind of man who paid others to get dirty. Gentlemen, Harrow said pleasantly, as if calling on neighbors. No need for anyone to get hurt. We just want what belongs to Mr. Kellerman. Those papers belong to the people he stole from, Emily said, stepping out from behind the wall. Harrow's eyes locked on the satchel. His polite smile thinned. Your father thought he could outplay powerful men. Look how that ended for him. Jacob raised his rifle, voice cold. The lady said no. The kitchen exploded into violence as fast as a lightning strike. Harrow swung his revolver toward Emily, but Jacob had already squeezed the trigger. The shot caught Harrow high in the chest, spinning him backward into the wall. His polished boots slipped on the wooden floor, leaving a smear of blood as he crumpled to one knee. Bill moved with surprising speed for a man his age, his revolver clearing leather in one smooth motion. 2 shots cracked loud and close, deafening in the small room. One of Harrow's men dropped instantly, dead before he hit the floor. The other dove behind the overturned table, firing wildly, bullets splintering the cabinet and shattering a coffee cup beside the stove. Go! Jacob roared, swinging the rifle toward the table. Emily grabbed the satchel and ran for the back window. The glass gave way under her boot heel, scattering shards across the floor. Cold night air rushed into the room. She scrambled through, breath coming fast, the satchel tight to her chest. Jacob ducked as another bullet tore through the doorway frame. He heard Bill's revolver bark again, one clean shot, and then the thud of a body hitting the floor. Silence followed, broken only by Jacob's own ragged breathing. The overturned table lay still. No more gunfire, just the stink of gunpowder hanging in the room, sharp as burned toast. Jacob risked a glance. Harrow was down but not dead, propped against the wall, blood soaking his fine shirt. The second rifleman lay sprawled across the floor, his eyes staring glassy at the ceiling. Bill stood calm as if nothing had happened, reloading with steady hands. You all right? Jacob asked, voice rough. Bill gave a single nod, unfazed. Never better. You. Jacob didn't answer. His eyes were on Harrow, who coughed wetly and let out a thin laugh. You've made a mistake, Harrow rasped, voice weak but still carrying malice. Kellerman will send more men. He'll send an army. Then we'd better make sure those papers get to the marshal first, Jacob said, lowering his rifle but keeping it ready. Harrow gave a gurgling laugh that turned into a cough, spraying blood across his chin. You think this ends anything? Men like Kellerman don't lose. Maybe not, Bill said, snapping his revolver cylinder shut. But they can bleed. Outside, hooves pounded hard and fast, but not toward the house, away from it. The other riders had decided they didn't want to die tonight. Jacob kept his eyes on Harrow, but in the corner of his vision, he saw movement. Emily appeared at the back window, face pale, hair loose and wild in the moonlight. They're gone, she called softly, voice shaking. Harrow heard her. His eyes rolled toward the sound of her voice, still sharp with hate, even as his strength drained out of him. He tried to speak again, but whatever words he meant to say never came. His breath rattled once, then stopped. His head slumped to the side, eyes fixed on nothing. Vincent Harrow, Marcus Kellerman's right hand, was dead on Jacob Nash's kitchen floor. Jacob lowered his rifle slowly. His arms ached from tension. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Bill let out a breath, sliding his revolver back into its holster. Well, he said simply, that's that. No, Jacob muttered, still staring at the body. That's the beginning. Emily climbed back inside, careful to avoid the broken glass. Her hands trembled as she clutched the satchel. She looked from Harrow to Jacob to Bill, her green eyes wide with shock. "I didn't want anyone to die," she whispered. Jacob wiped sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. "They didn't give us much choice." He looked at her more carefully. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head quickly, though her breath was coming fast, almost panicked. "I'm fine. I didn't expect." Her voice broke off, and she looked at the blood soaking into the floorboards. Jacob stepped closer, his voice softer now. "Listen to me. You didn't do this. Kellerman did. He sent these men." Bill crouched by Harrow's body, checking for any sign of life, though they both knew there was none. He stood again, slow and deliberate. "What's next?" Jacob looked at the satchel in Emily's arms. "We get those papers to the territorial marshal before Kellerman's next wave shows up." Her hands tightened on the leather strap. "They'll follow us." "Let 'em," Bill said with a thin smile. "Be nice to stretch my legs." But Jacob's gaze stayed on her, reading the fear in her face, the guilt. She was young, scared, and carrying something that could topple one of the most powerful men west of the Mississippi. And now she'd seen what standing up to him cost. Jacob felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. The responsibility, the danger, the certainty that nothing about his quiet life would ever be quiet again. He'd written a letter looking for companionship, someone to share the long, empty nights. What he got instead was blood on his floorboards and a target painted on his back. He met Emily's eyes, steady and firm. "We leave at first light." The night passed without sleep. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, his rifle across his lap. Bill dozed in a chair, hat tipped forward, one hand resting on his revolver. Emily sat by the cold stove with the satchel clutched to her chest like it might be stolen out of her arms. None of them spoke much. The bodies of the men outside had been dragged behind the barn, covered with canvas until morning. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. When dawn came, the light was gray and thin. Jacob stood stiffly, feeling every mile of his years in his bones. He poured water into a pan and scrubbed blood off the floor with a rag. Emily watched him, her face pale. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. "It's my floor," Jacob answered. His voice was even, but inside, he hated how steady it sounded. It was easier to work than to think. Bill stretched, yawned, and stood. "We'd better move quick," he said. "If Kellerman's got more riders, they'll be coming fast." Jacob nodded. "We'll take the west trail. Less traveled." Emily looked at him, fear flickering in her eyes. "Are we running or fighting?" "Both," Jacob said simply. "We get those papers to the marshal. We do it before Kellerman figures out what happened here." They packed light. Jacob saddled 3 horses while Bill kept watch with his revolver. Emily wore a borrowed coat that hung too big on her, her hair pulled back under Jacob's old hat. The satchel never left her hands. When they were ready to ride, Jacob stopped at the door and looked back at his house. He'd built it board by himself. Now the doorframe was splintered, the floor scarred. He didn't know if he'd ever see it again. "Let's go," Bill said quietly. They rode hard through the canyon, following a narrow path Jacob knew well. The morning air was sharp, carrying the smell of dust and pine. Emily stayed close behind Jacob, gripping the reins tight, eyes darting at every sound. After an hour, Bill slowed his horse, scanning the ridge. "We're being followed," he said flatly. Jacob glanced back. In the distance, small figures moved through the haze, 4 riders now, maybe more. They were closing the gap. Emily's face went white. "They'll catch us." "Not if we keep moving," Jacob said. "Stay close. Don't fall behind." They pushed the horses faster. Rocks clattered down the slope, hooves striking sparks on stone. The sun climbed higher, throwing long shadows that stretched across the trail. By midday, they reached a creek where Jacob called a halt. The horses needed water, and so did they. Jacob crouched to fill his canteen, his hands steady though his mind was racing. Emily knelt beside him, watching the water swirl past. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. Jacob looked up at her, surprised. "Because you need it. You could have sent me away," she said. "You didn't even know me yesterday." Jacob tightened the cap on his canteen. "I know enough now. Kellerman's not going to win this." Her lip trembled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Jacob saw tears in her eyes. My father tried to fight him. It got him killed. Jacob's voice softened. Your father was brave. Brave men die sometimes. But if we don't finish what he started, then he died for nothing. Bill rode up, his eyes on the trail behind them. They're closer, he said. We've got maybe an hour before they catch up. Jacob stood and swung into his saddle. Then we ride. They stayed ahead of the pursuers through the afternoon, cutting across dry gullies and rocky ground to throw off the trail. But as the sun dropped lower, Jacob knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The marshal's office in Carson Springs was still a full day's ride away. When they stopped at a sheltered hollow to rest the horses, Bill spoke low so Emily wouldn't hear. We need a plan. They're going to catch us before we get there. Jacob nodded grimly. Then we pick where we meet them. On our terms. Bill's eyes narrowed. You talking about fighting? Jacob looked over at Emily, who sat on a fallen log holding the satchel, her shoulders shaking as if she were cold though the evening air was still warm. I'm talking about protecting her, he said. Whatever it takes. Bill spat into the dust. All right then. Let's make it count. The sun slid low in the sky, staining the rocks red as they chose their ground. Jacob led them off the main trail to a narrow pass where high walls of stone squeezed the path to no more than a wagon's width. A place where numbers didn't matter so much, where 2 rifles could hold off 6 if you pick your shots right. This will do, Jacob said, dismounting. He ran a hand over his horse's neck, calming the restless animal. The quiet was heavy here. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Bill nodded, already checking his revolver. Good sight lines. They won't get around us without climbing. Emily looked from one man to the other, clutching the satchel so tightly her knuckles went white. You gonna fight them here? Jacob kept his voice calm. If they want these papers, they'll have to come through us. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she swallowed hard and stood straighter. What do you want me to do? Stay low, Jacob said. When a shooting starts, take the horses and ride for Carson Springs. Don't look back. I won't leave you, she said fiercely. You will, Jacob said, his tone leaving no room for debate. That's an order. They worked fast. Jacob and Bill pulled loose rocks from the slope to build cover. Emily filled canteens and tore strips of cloth for bandages, her hands shaking but steady enough to work. The light faded, painting the sky purple. Somewhere in the distance, the faint drum of hoofbeats carried on the evening air. By the time the riders appeared at the far end of the pass, the world was deep in shadow. 4 of them, just as Bill had counted. They rode in slow, careful, rifles resting across their saddles. These weren't boys out looking for trouble. They were professionals. Evening Ash, one of them called. His voice echoed off the rock walls. Hand over the girl, and we'll let you live. Jacob rose just enough to be seen, rifle steady in his hands. Come take her, he called back. The answer was a single shot. The bullet smacked into the rocks near Jacob's head, spraying stone chips. Jacob didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, and one of the riders toppled backward off his horse before the sound of the first shot even died away. Down, Jacob barked, shoving Emily behind cover. Bill's revolver roared, dropping a second man who tried to charge through the pass. The remaining 2 dismounted and scrambled for rocks, returning fire with sharp cracks that echoed between the canyon walls. Jacob felt the air move past his cheek as a bullet shaved the stone where his head had been. He fired again, aiming for the shadow of a man behind a boulder. The figure jerked and went still. Only one left now, but this one was careful. He stayed low, trading shots without showing himself. Beside Jacob, Bill grunted and dropped to one knee. Got me in the shoulder, he muttered, pressing a hand to the wound. Blood seeped through his shirt, dark in the fading light. You still with me? Jacob asked, reloading fast. Long as I'm breathing, Bill said, grimacing through clenched teeth. Emily crawled to them, ignoring Jacob's warning glare. Let me see, she whispered, tearing a strip of cloth and tying it tight around Bill's shoulder to slow the bleeding. Her hands were slick with blood by the time she finished, but she didn't flinch. The last gunman made his move, breaking from cover to rush closer. Jacob didn't think. He just swung the rifle, fired, and saw the man fall hard onto the rocks. The echoes of the shot rolled away into silence. Jacob stayed still, waiting for movement, listening to the horses stamping nervously down the trail. But no more shots came. Only the sound of his own breathing and Emily's soft sob as she pressed the bloody rag tighter against Bill's shoulder. "It's over," Jacob said at last, lowering the rifle. Bill gave a thin smile. "For now." Emily looked at them both, her face pale but set with stubborn resolve. "We can't stop. Kellerman won't quit." Jacob nodded. "Then we don't quit either. We ride tonight." Bill shook his head. "You two go. I'll slow you down." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Not leaving you behind." "You ain't got a choice," Bill said. "I can ride to my place and hole up a while. They'll think I've got her. You take her to Carson Springs." Emily shook her head violently. "No, we all go together." Jacob met Bill's eyes, saw the steady determination there. He hated it, but he understood. "All right," he said finally. "You go east. We go west. Meet in town if we make it." Bill nodded once. "Take care of her and Ash." "I will," Jacob said. They mounted up under the rising moon. Bill's silhouette vanished into the dark, riding slow but steady toward his ranch. Jacob and Emily turned west, pushing their horses hard, the satchel bouncing against Emily's side with every stride. Behind them, the pass lay silent except for the bodies cooling on the rocks. The night air cut sharp as they rode, the kind that made a man's lungs ache. The moon was bright enough to paint the desert silver, but Jacob kept glancing over his shoulder all the same. Emily's horse pounded close behind him, her hat pulled low, her small frame swaying with every stride. She held the satchel tight, as if letting go for even a moment would cost her life. They didn't speak for a long time. The only sounds were hooves striking the hard earth and the distant cry of a night bird. When they finally slowed near a dry wash to rest the horses, Jacob swung down stiffly and offered her a hand. She dismounted without taking it. "You cold?" Jacob asked. Emily shook her head, though her teeth were chattering. "I'm fine." He pulled his coat off and held it out. "Don't argue. You're shaking." She took it with a small nod, slipping it around her shoulders. The coat nearly swallowed her. For the first time since she stepped off the wagon, she looked like what she really was, a young woman far from home, scared and exhausted. Jacob crouched to check his rifle. "You holding up?" Emily lowered herself to sit on a flat rock, her voice low. "I keep seeing them, the men we shot." Jacob paused, looking at her carefully. Her face glowed pale in the moonlight, her hands clenched in her lap. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't carry that weight. They came here to kill you. You didn't pull the trigger. But you did." Her voice cracked. "And Bill. For me." Jacob let out a slow breath, staring at the ground. "I've done worse things in my life than this. Don't make it heavier than it already is." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the restless shuffle of the horses. Finally she whispered, "I didn't lie about my father. He was a good man. He just made a bad deal when times got hard. Kellerman owned him before he knew it." Jacob nodded, listening. When my father realized what Kellerman was doing, stealing from his own bank customers, he tried to stop him. He started keeping records, names, dates. He told me if anything happened to him, I had to run. Emily's voice trembled now. "I didn't think they'd kill him so fast." One day he was home. The next they found him in the barn. Jacob reached out without thinking and put a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry." She looked up at him, eyes shining in the moonlight. "Why are you helping me, Jacob? You don't even know me." He held her gaze. "Because I know what it feels like to be alone, and I know what it's like to wish someone cared whether you lived or died." Her eyes softened at that, and she didn't look away. For a moment, the danger around them faded, and they were just two people sitting under a wide, empty sky, both carrying scars no one else could see. Jacob finally broke the silence. "We'd better move before dawn. If Kellerman's got more men on the trail, we need to be in Carson Springs by morning." They rode again, keeping to the low ground, pushing the horses harder than was wise. By the time the eastern sky turned pale, Emily's face was drawn, her lips cracked from wind and dust. Jacob knew she was running on nothing but fear and stubbornness. At sunrise, they spotted smoke in the distance. The little town still miles away, but within reach. Jacob felt a surge of relief. though he didn't let it show. "We're close," he called over his shoulder. Emily's voice was hoarse. "What if Kellerman's men get there first?" "Then we ride faster," Jacob said simply. By mid-morning, they reached the edge of Carson Springs, its main street quiet in the early hour. Jacob led them straight to the territorial marshal's office, a low stone building with a sign swinging in the wind. He dismounted stiffly and helped Emily down. Inside, Marshal Wade sat behind a cluttered desk, gray hair under a battered hat, eyes sharp as nails. He looked up as Jacob pushed through the door. "Morning, Nash," Wade said. "Heard you were expecting a bride." Jacob stepped aside so Emily could enter, the satchel still clutched tight to her chest. "This is Emily Pierce," Jacob said evenly, "and she's got something you need to see." The marshal frowned as Emily placed the satchel on his desk and opened it with trembling fingers. "These are my father's records," she said softly. "Everything Kellerman's been doing. Every dollar he's stolen. Every man he's paid off." Wade flipped through the papers, his expression hardening. "This is enough to hang that bastard twice over," he muttered. Jacob leaned against the wall, rifle still in hand. "You'd better move fast. Harrow's dead. Kellerman will come looking." Wade stood, tucking the papers under his arm. "I'll telegraph the governor myself. We'll have warrants out before noon." He looked at Emily with something close to respect. "You're a brave girl." Emily shook her head. "No, I'm just tired of running." News traveled faster than horses. By sunset, the territorial marshal had telegraphed the governor, and warrants for Marcus Kellerman's arrest spread through every post office and sheriff's office across the territory. But Kellerman didn't wait to be arrested. By the time Jacob and Emily left Carson Springs, word had already come that he'd fled east on the morning stagecoach, running from the noose like a rat leaving a sinking ship. 3 weeks later, Jacob stood on the porch of the courthouse in town, his hat in hand, listening as the judge read the charges out loud. Fraud, theft, murder by proxy. Words that would follow Kellerman for the rest of his life. However short that life turned out to be. He'd lost his empire. The families he'd cheated would never see their money again, but they got something more important: justice and the knowledge that he couldn't hurt anyone else. Emily stood beside Jacob in a simple blue dress she'd sewn from fabric bought in town, using money from selling one of Harrow's fine horses. Her hands didn't shake anymore. The fear in her green eyes was gone, replaced by something steadier, resolve, and maybe hope. When the judge finished reading the indictment, he turned to them with a small smile. "I understand you, too, have business of your own?" Jacob glanced at Emily, and she gave a small nod. The judge cleared his throat and spoke the words that made them husband and wife, simple and plain as sunlight. Jacob slid a thin gold band onto her finger, not out of desperation or loneliness this time, but out of choice. They walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand. The autumn wind carried the smell of dust and distant rain. Jacob looked down at Emily and saw how young she still was, but also how much older she'd become in a single season. "Ready to go home?" Jacob asked. Emily smiled, really smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. "I've been ready since the day I stepped off that wagon." The ride back to the ranch was quiet and peaceful. Bill Caldwell, his arms still in a sling but healing, rode with them part of the way before turning toward his own place. He didn't say much, he never did, but he gave Jacob a look that said more than words could. A look of pride and of trust. When they reached the ranch, Jacob swung down from his horse and stood for a long moment staring at the doorway. Remembering the night, everything changed: the broken door, the gun smoke, the fear. Emily came to stand beside him. "It feels different now," she said softly. "Yeah," Jacob said. "It does." Inside, the house smelled of coffee again. The floorboards were scrubbed clean, though the scars would always remain if you knew where to look. Jacob poured 2 cups and set one in front of Emily. This time, her hand found his without hesitation. "You know," she said with a faint smile, "I never told you how you take your coffee." "You told me." Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I guess I did." They sat there for a while in companionable silence, watching the sun dip low behind the hills. For the first time in years, Jacob felt something he hadn't dared hope for: peace. Not because the world was safe, but because he wasn't facing it alone anymore. The lesson was clear, even if Jacob never said it out loud. A man can hide from the world for a long time, but life has a way of finding you anyway. You can build walls around yourself. You can tell yourself you don't need anyone, but sooner or later, you'll learn what Jacob learned. That some burdens are too heavy to carry alone, and some fights are worth the cost. As the evening light faded and the first stars appeared, Emily leaned her head against Jacob's shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Not a thing," Jacob said. "Even if it cost me everything, I'd still open that door." The wind shifted outside, rattling the loose board on the porch step, the one Jacob always meant to fix. For once, he didn't mind. Some things didn't need to be perfect. They just needed to last.